Hello and welcome to the Fit to Transform podcast, where you learn how to train and diet effectively and, most importantly, how to maintain those results for life, once and for all. I'm Nikias Tomasiello, a transgender training and nutrition coach working online with anyone who's ready for a true lifestyle transformation, anywhere they may be in the world. As a friendly reminder, any and all information provided is for educational purposes only. You should consult with your doctor before implementing any changes to your diet and exercise program. With that disclaimer out of the way, thank you for being here. Now grab yourself a cup of tea or pre-workouts and enjoy.
Yo, dear listeners, welcome back to the podcast. Today I have Coach Shannon Beer with me again, after I originally interviewed her for the first time in episode 78, which was titled How to Pursue Physique Goals with a Healthier Mindset. And you're going to find a link in the show notes. This time, we'll be talking about achieving your fitness goals without tracking calories and macros. Shannon, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me back.
I'm going to go straight into my first question for you, which is about a piece of content you made a while ago in which you stated macro tracking should not, and not was underlined, should not be a default approach to nutrition coaching. My question to you is why?
The reason I said that is because there should not be any default approach. And I think that is something that we find a lot in the fitness industry is we take a client, they tell us about their goals, and the default seems to be that we put them onto macros and off we go. And what's missing there is more of an assessment phase. So, what does this client actually need? And I find that many of us coaches are trained in the fat loss, macro tracking sort of mindset. Maybe we've had experience ourselves of macro tracking and we've experienced personal success. And then we assume that that's the ideal way to coach everyone without really considering any other approach. So I think in order to do our clients justice and give them what they really need, we need to have more tools in our coaching toolkit and to be able to assess clients as they come in so that we know what the best approach is for them rather than defaulting to macro tracking because it's the easiest thing to coach.
That's an excellent point to make, especially if one prides themselves on offering a truly personalized service. If you slot somebody into the calorie and macro tracking method immediately, it's not truly personalized, is it?
Exactly. Not if there isn't a clear rationale for choosing that approach. And I think that what we tend to see is that coaches want some kind of confirmation that their approach is working, and numbers are something that we can easily measure and manage. And I think that sometimes that can do, as I said, to the client an injustice because it's not always the best approach for everyone.
Agreed. Then my next question would be, in your experience, in which situations might tracking calories and macros be helpful to the client?
I think if you have fitness, like performance related goals that you're looking to optimize for, and you're happy to sort of go to that extent of tracking calories and macros, and the client isn't currently struggling with their body image or any disordered eating patterns, then I think that that could be a good opportunity to track calories and macros. So, for example, I have recently gotten into running. I'm quite enjoying going on a run and challenging myself. And I don't currently track my calories or macros. But if I was considering entering into a race, or I was training for like an endurance event and really challenging myself, I might decide to track my calories and macros in order to ensure that I'm fueling myself appropriately for my training. That would be one example of that. And I'm not currently struggling with my body image. I can comfortably eat without tracking, there's no anxiety there. So I would be a prime candidate for tracking my calories and macros in a helpful way. But I think that's not often where people start.
That makes sense. Now, the last time you were on, this is a follow-up question, by the way. The last time you were on, we talked about how one can pursue body composition goals with a healthy mindset. So if a client wasn't struggling at the moment with their body image in any particular way, and they had physique or body composition related goals, do you think that macro and calorie tracking could be a good option ever?
Personally, I think that the only time that we can pursue a physique goal in a healthy way is if the purpose of that goal is to compete in a sport. So, if someone is pursuing a physique goal to challenge themselves or to feel more confident in their bodies, I don't think that is a healthy way to approach a physique goal. So if it's in the context of a sport, then absolutely, because that standard is set by the sport, it's kind of a condition of competing in that way. That would be when I'd say that tracking calories and macros could be helpful for that person if they've already done the foundational work on building their sense of self, because that would reduce their risk of experiencing any harmful consequences of taking their nutrition to that degree.
Ah, that's an interesting view that I disagree with. Why is it that you think that the only context in which that would be helpful would be that of a sporting or a sport related endeavor in terms of body composition goals?
Because we can clearly attribute the success. So, in the context of bodybuilding, you're judged on your physique. So, we can argue that changing our body composition is necessary for that purpose, right? Because that's the whole point of that sport in particular. When it comes to day to day, I think that in my experience and based on the research, reasons that people have for changing their body composition tends to be coming from a place of I want to feel more confident, or I want other people to respect me, or I want to build a successful business and I have to look a certain way. And all of those beliefs are unhelpful beliefs that tend to, if we go down that path, can cause more problems further down the line. So, someone who's relying on their body composition to build confidence might experience an initial boost in feeling good about themselves, but then their confidence in themselves is contingent upon how they look. So when the scale weight fluctuates, when they're around people who are fitter or stronger and more attractive, then their confidence plummets. So that's not a stable sense of confidence. So I wouldn't argue that building confidence through a physique is a helpful approach. The only different context would be, and this is where I think it gets really nuanced, is that many of my clients in larger bodies will say that they want to feel more comfortable from the perspective of certain movement patterns are easier when they're in a smaller body, and certain activities that they want to do are easier for them. Traveling is more comfortable. They'll say that they experience pain in their joints. And again, the research on that is a little bit nuanced, where it may not be a direct correlation between body weight and joint pain. But there are, I believe, some circumstances where clients would experience more comfort and more mobility is not the right word, but being able to do, for example, a deadlift can be more challenging in a larger body. So, for clients like that who really want the functionality of their body to improve, and we may be able to say that that could be in part associated with body size, then that could be a motive where losing that body fat may be justified. But I don't think that that would change the approach that we would take about focusing on health over and above body composition. So I think there are very few situations where directly changing our body composition leads to any outcomes that aren't mediated by other things.
That makes sense. Thank you for explaining. I'll have you back probably to talk more about this since we have different views, and I think it would be interesting to have a debate about it. Now, I'm going to move the conversation back to the main topic of calorie and macro tracking, and it actually occurred to me that it might be interesting, especially for the listeners, if you could talk about whether you see calorie and macro tracking as a long-term strategy or a short-term tool.
I think it depends on the purpose. So, although we're talking a lot about how macro tracking might be unhelpful, it shouldn't be a default approach, it's not inherently problematic. The issue tends to be more so our approach to tracking and our reasons for wanting to track. So, in terms of a short term strategy, many people will argue that macro tracking is a great way to educate people on nutrition. I would argue that there are more effective ways to do that, in the sense that when we're focusing on numbers and calories, we tend not to focus on the nutrient quality of the foods that we're eating. So it could potentially serve as a short term strategy to gain nutritional knowledge. But I would argue that there are more effective ways to do that. In terms of a long term approach, again, if I was training for a marathon, that might be a long term, that's going to be a few months of solid training that I may want to support myself with, particularly in this is an example where it can be very easy to underfuel because endurance training would require a decent carbohydrate intake, which can be difficult to achieve without that level of awareness. So that would be an example. In terms of I need to track in order to maintain my body composition, that's when I think it gets problematic.
Yeah, excellent. Very exhaustive answer. Now, on that note, because a lot of people feel the need to track in order to feel a sense of control over their body composition and appearance, um, the listeners may not be aware of whether they would be a good candidate for moving away from tracking. And so I
Mm.
think an interesting question would be which clients, which type of person should consider moving away from calorie tracking, even though they may not want to. They may feel icky about it or uncomfortable about it.
Yeah, it's definitely normal to experience some resistance, some uncertainty about moving away from macro tracking. Specifically, as you say, for some people, it can give like an illusion of control. And the reason that I call it an illusion is because you're not actually in control if you need to track in order to feel that way. You've outsourced your control to MyFitnessPal or whatever app that you're using. So, to determine who may benefit from moving away, in terms of a coaching perspective, the first thing that all coaches should be screening their clients for when they come to work with them would be body image concerns or and their eating behaviors. So a question that we can ask our clients is, does your weight or your shape affect how you feel about yourself as a person? And if someone says yes, that indicates that they would benefit from working on their body image. And macro tracking is typically contraindicated because it's very hard to improve how you feel about your body if you are tightly trying to control how you look. And that's what macro tracking is often used for, keeping us at a certain body fat percentage, maintaining our physique as it is. And I think that people will, if they're thinking about this question, that's probably a good indication that they would benefit from moving away. But some clear signs to look out for would be, does the thought of not tracking your macros make you feel anxious? That's a sign that you've outsourced your control and again may benefit from moving away. Are you also thinking about your step count in the same way? Do you tend to feel reluctant about agreeing to social events because you're worried about messing up your fitness routine? When are you going to get your steps in? You might have to move around some workouts. You're worried about the food on offer and how you're going to track that. how you're going to compensate for that. If you go out for lunch, what do you have for dinner? Making those compensations there. Those are all signs that you would benefit from moving away. I would also think about not just how comfortable you feel when you're tracking, but as I say, when you're like the thought of not tracking, are you able to take time away from tracking and still feel comfortable in that? Are you able to make food choices when you don't know the exact calories of the meals that you're consuming? Or is that's something that makes you feel anxious? Do you often check your body in the mirror, take progress photos, weigh yourself? Those are all behaviors as well that I would be paying attention to. So when we're looking at macro tracking, it's not in isolation, because macro tracking for most people is just one of the behaviors that they're doing to control their body composition. And this is, again, I'm distinguishing this between performance based fueling. That's like a different scenario. But for the majority of people who are trying to control their body weight through macro tracking, these are all the signs that I would be looking out for.
Excellent. And then when you say that one would benefit from moving away, what are the actual benefits that your clients and yourself have experienced when they and you have moved away from macro and calorie tracking?
Freedom, headspace, everything that you can do through macro tracking when it comes to controlling your body composition, you can do without macro tracking. So it's just a case of, oh, why would I be going to that extra effort to control everything when I could just regulate my appetite in that way and achieve the same outcome to an extent, depending on how lean you're trying to be, right? So, for context, my history and background with macro tracking is that I used to track my macros. I honestly don't think I ever had a problem with it. I was quite flexible with what I ate, eating out never stressed me out. The only reason I stopped tracking my macros is because I went traveling. So it was literally pointless because I was eating out every single meal. There was no purpose to knowing that information because I wouldn't have made any different choices anyway. I was like, oh, okay, well, I guess I'm just not tracking anymore. My performance in the gym didn't change. I was still performing well. My body composition didn't change. And what I will say in terms of some benefits, as well as thinking less about food and having more flexibility when eating out, no longer choosing the option on the menu that we know is the lowest in calories and the most macro friendly, but sometimes giving ourselves permission to choose what we want to choose, or always having that permission, sometimes choosing to do that, right? And that would be one thing. So the freedom that you have in your ability to eat out and connect with others, and the experience of shifting my view of nutrition. So I used to, when I was macro tracking, of course, look at food in terms of the macronutrients. Like, okay, that's carbohydrate, and that's a protein source that doesn't have much fat in. Awesome. When I went traveling, I started to look at food from a different perspective. I did a lot of cooking classes in Thailand, Bali, Greece, like all these different places, and learning about the role of food in different cultures and just like the joy of cooking, I think was really huge for me. And I began to experiment and find a lot of pleasure in cooking meals that I probably wouldn't have made if I was macro tracking, because it's a bit of a pain in the ass to track a million different ingredients, right? So my meals have become more enjoyable because I'm experimenting more. And if we were to look at them, they would still be considered macro friendly meals, but I just don't feel the need to weigh out all of the different ingredients and to calculate a serving size and all the rest of it, because I'm cooking that meal for health and enjoyment and pleasure. So that would, I would say, would be a benefit that I experienced, as well as having that extra headspace. And then it's like I'm viewing myself differently, because my value isn't in my ability to control my body composition. My value is in who I am as a person. and having like a deeper appreciation and understanding of who I am and what I care about and my personality and what I have to offer. That I think is a fringe benefit that people don't consider, because when we're talking about moving away from macro tracking, we're not just talking about we're not putting our food into our phones anymore. We're talking about shifting our perspective of ourselves and what we really care about. And when your appearance is no longer something that's on your mind so much, you're so much more free to be able to think about who you are and who you want to be, and having that enjoyment in a variety of different domains. I think that's a major benefit, as well as the freedom that comes from expressing your personality in your clothing and thinking about aesthetics, not just in terms of muscle mass and body fat distribution, but also in terms of like personal style and embodiment, like your posture, your expression, what kind of person you are there. So that was like just some of the benefits that I experienced, and that I think is why I'm passionate about showing people a different alternative approach, not just because of the potential risks of disordered eating, because that isn't always the case for people, but because of the broader perspective that you stand to gain in life. And the fact that you can make healthy food choices, you can live in a healthy body without needing to track. So, if it's not adding any additional benefit, and can come at a cost, why? What's the purpose there?
That was fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing about your personal experience. It really helped me ground what we're talking about into practical examples, and I think it will also help the audience. Now, since it was such an exhaustive
Mm.
answer, it actually covered some of the objections that I was going to throw at you, typical objections that I get or that I've heard from people when talking about letting go of calorie and macro tracking. One objection that still stands out that I think you might not have covered in quite that much detail is tracking holds me accountable. Without it, the floodgates open and I eat a lot of crap in quotation marks. So let's imagine that this is a client giving you this objection. How would you respond to it?
Firstly, I would validate that that is a common experience, and it's completely understandable why we would feel hesitant about moving away from macro tracking if we have felt like we've let ourselves go, and as you say, I haven't developed the skill of self accountability, because we can still hold ourselves accountable because we want to feel good in our bodies. And that tends to involve making health conscious food choices, right? The foods that are macro friendly also tend to be the foods that are high in, well, not always. So this is the one of the nuances as well. But in terms of fruits, veggies, protein, carbohydrates, like they serve purposes in our bodies, and that's what gives us energy to go out and do all the things that we enjoy doing. So, what this person would be lacking if they just eat a load of crap, that is an indication that they're experiencing a lot of dietary restraint. They feel, and this makes sense because when we're tracking our calories for the purposes of controlling our body composition, we are always engaging in dietary restraint. So it's like being on a diet almost. You may have more flexibility. You may not be putting yourself in a calorie deficit. It might be for the purposes of maintenance, but you're still tightly controlling everything. So, yes, you'll give yourself permission to eat some chocolate, but only if it fits your macros. So, it's still conditional, which makes a lot of sense. Why? When that restraint is lifted, it feels like we've been let off a leash, and we're letting ourselves go because we haven't developed the skill of learning how to eat in an empowering way. And that involves self accountability and really I know it can be a bit vague when people say developing like that connection, listening to your body, but when you eat a load of crap, that doesn't feel good. So you're not staying connected to your body in that moment because you're eating past comfort, you're eating even past satisfaction because at some point that doesn't feel satisfying. And that's when we get regretful. So for some people, when moving away from dietary restraints, if we don't do it in a structured way, it can lead to those feelings. So the mistake wasn't moving away from macros, the mistake was not having an alternative structure. And that's something that I think a lot of people would benefit from working on.
That makes sense. In addition to all of the potential objections that you've already covered so far, are there any other that are relatively common that your clients have brought to you that you think would be interesting for the listeners to cover in this episode?
With my clients, there are few objections. And the reason for that is because they're aware of the downsides and they're already tired of it. They're already tired of thinking about food all of the time. They know that it's possible to make healthy food choices without tracking. You don't actually need to know how many calories you're consuming every day. If you've got energy, you're recovering well, and your clothes fit, right? That's a sign that you're maintaining. And you probably don't need to know how many calories you're consuming because your body is maintaining itself. So what purpose does that information serve? So my clients already know that. They know that it's possible to live in a healthy body without the stress of macro tracking that it can cause for some people. And um, in because of that, they're ready to try something new. They just want to know how. And there can be some fears along the way. That's completely normal part of the process. But because we're able to work through those in coaching, it doesn't become a roadblock. So I do think that the belief that tracking is the only way I can maintain my body composition, that's a common belief. But when you're moving away from tracking, you're not necessarily changing what you're eating. So if you've tracked for a while and you've maintained a healthy body composition, why would you suddenly stop eating that just because you're no longer tracking it? You know, you could just do the whole day and not track it. Most of us eat similar meals for breakfast, fairly similar. We might have a few different meals on rotation, but our eating patterns don't vary dramatically day to day. So if you've already found that stability, why would you suddenly change all of that just because you're no longer tracking? So I think that that's proof. Like your body doesn't know that you're counting. So clearly you're able to regulate that. It's just a case of confidence and shifting that belief that it's safe to move away because my body composition is just one part of me. It's not the most important part.
Yeah, that's such a powerful answer. It resonates with me a lot because it's the objection I respond uh, to my clients with when I'm helping them transition away from tracking, and they tell me, "Well, how do I know that I'm maintaining?" And I'm like, "Are you gonna change what you're gonna eat? Like tomorrow, you're gonna have a completely new way of eating because you're no longer putting it into my fitness pal?" And they're like, "No." And I'm like, "So then do you need to still know?"
Yeah, exactly. But I think the fear comes from an understandable place and they can see that logically. They know that they're probably not going to eat differently, but it doesn't feel reassuring all of the time because they're still focused on their body composition as opposed to the benefits and the different perspective that they can get when they move away.
Absolutely. I only laugh because I tend to find that humor helps soothe discomfort. So I don't make fun of my clients. I help them laugh at their own um, insecurities because laughing at my own helps me overcome them. That's all. In any case, now that we've covered these concerns, I want to ask you a question about the kind of mindset that you would want to build, that you would want to create, so that you can successfully move away from tracking and continue to achieve your goal instead of losing progress? Because I think among all of the concerns we've discussed, the biggest fear is that people are afraid of backtracking in their own fitness journey if they don't track calories and macros. So what kind of mindset does a person to whom that doesn't happen have?
I think it involves redefining what success and progress actually looks like. Because many people, again, measure success in terms of how much weight did I lose and what is my body weight now? Am I maintaining that? If yes, then I'm successful. But if you're maintaining that at a cost and it's coming at the expense of your enjoyment, of your social life, it's getting in the way of your relationships because you're reluctant to eat out and your partner is a foodie, or, all of these things, then is that really a success? Or is the goal, and this is often the case for my clients, to eat a fairly balanced diet with some space for enjoyment, to be able to socialize and be present and connect with our friends, to be adventurous and say yes to spontaneous plans, to still make progress in the gym and feel strong and fit and healthy, and to live a life that we enjoy? For most people, that's success. So when it comes to not losing progress, again, how much progress have you made if you feel controlled by MyFitnessPal? Maybe there's still some progress to go. And what that looks like is not measured in your body composition, but measured in your enjoyment of life and living a life that feels aligned with what you truly care about. And as I say, for many of my clients, that looks like the freedom to travel. And we might see success as going away to an island and not stressing when you don't have a gym to go to, and finding other ways to move, or just using that as a time to take some rest and not feeling guilty about it. That can be a sign of success. Success can also look like going to the gym and wearing a sports bra even when you don't feel your best. So that has been a goal that my clients have moved towards, is wearing what they want to wear independent of how lean they are. That's success. So when it comes to the mindset, what we're really tapping into is what we truly care about and living in accordance with that, and not letting how we feel about our bodies get in the way of doing what's important to us. For my clients in particular, that is what their version of success is. And it involves like being comfortable around other people. It involves having hobbies and things that we care about outside of fitness. That's their version of success. So when we're moving away, we're building on that. We're gaining progress as opposed to seeing that as a loss.
Excellent, very thought provoking. So now I think it's time that we start defining what life without calorie tracking and macro tracking looks like. And you've already hinted at this when you said that people may be concerned about letting go of that tool because they don't have a structure to replace this tool with. So I would like you to speak more about this structure and any other elements that you believe is important to introduce in place of macro and calorie tracking.
Yeah, so if we're talking about the person who has tracked for some time and they're happy with their nutrition in the sense of they're not actively working on a nutrition related goal. In their view, they've achieved their goals and now they're just maintaining and wanting to think about moving away. They've already got the structure in place because they're probably eating, a consistent meal pattern. They are probably including a balance of protein, carbohydrates, fats, fruits, and veggies in each meal. Those are all the things that you need in terms of building a balanced plate and having a supportive structure. The supportive structure extends beyond simply meal patterns to things like training. Do you feel like you have a fairly regular training routine that you're happy with? Are you going to bed and waking up at a fairly similar time each day? That's the structure that we need to support our body's ability to regulate itself. And someone who has been tracking is likely living a highly structured life. And that's, kind of what that facilitates. So that structure is already in place. The knowledge of how to build a balanced plate is probably already in place, because that is one of the benefits that we often speak about when it comes to macro tracking. We learn, what's a carbohydrate, what's a source of fat. So we know how to build a balanced plate. The last thing that I think that people need, and this is probably the part that the majority of people would benefit from focusing on, is actually building that connection with themselves and their needs. So this is where we start to build out that view of ourselves that goes beyond just how we look. So thinking about, what do we really value and how do we tend to embody those values in our life? So I value adventure and flexibility, and I can embody that through traveling. Someone who is feeling very restricted by macro tracking and feeling like trapped in their fitness routine, they might value and really like the idea of traveling and adventure, but they're not currently doing it because of the anxiety that it brings up. So that would be an example of a gap that we would work on bridging. Another thing would be viewing, like having that appreciation of our bodies. So moving away from looking at our bodies from the outside and thinking about what our bodies do for us, not just in terms of our performance at the gym, but the fact that the whole reason that we have bodies in the first place is because they're keeping us alive and helping us to experience our life. So building upon that appreciation for our bodies, and that could be, you don't like your arms, maybe that your arms aren't lean and muscular enough, but your arms allow you to cuddle and hold your loved ones. And you can hold both of those experiences at once. So a woman who's gone through pregnancy may not like how her stomach looks postpartum, but she can appreciate the fact that she's just given birth to a new life. So we're moving away from just evaluating our body based on how much we like how it looks, and actually developing appreciation for our bodies and all the things that they do for us. So that would be building that deeper connection. And then I think what the important point is, a lot of people, particularly the clients that I work with, they turn towards a physique goal because they want to gain respect, they want to feel desirable around other people. And that indicates that someone's probably experienced a lot of loneliness, and they are trying to become attractive, but what they really need is a deeper connection with other people, because a surface level attraction is not actually a connection. You can get catcalled walking down the road, and that's not building a connection with that person. And what we actually want is relationships with people that really accept us for who we are, that we feel like we can be ourselves around. So that is often part of building that connection with our needs, is building out our connections with other people and finding communities of people that share similar interests. And again, if for someone who's been very stuck in the fitness sort of space, that might look like building non-fitness related connections, like joining a book club, or like learning a new skill, getting guitar lessons, like whatever it looks like for that person. Building out that, because that tends to be the most common reason I think that people struggle to let go, is because that's where their self-esteem is coming from. And what we really need is self-acceptance, where yes, I like looking a certain way, we're all going to have desires and preferences, but we don't value ourselves on that. So I think I've used this example before. I will get tattoos because I like how they look, so I like the appearance of my tattoos, but my worth as a person does not depend on how many tattoos I have, right? So that's just one example. So I think that building out that connection with ourselves and our needs, and viewing ourselves as a person, not just a body, that's where most of the work occurs.
Excellent. And just for the listeners, the three elements that we've talked about, that you would want to include in a macro and calorie tracking free life include a supportive structure and routine for your meals, knowledge of how to build a balanced plate, and connection with yourself and your needs, which thank you for covering in so much depth, Shannon. Now, I have a few follow-up questions on what this macro and calorie tracking free life might look like. And the first question is, how do you know how how to gauge your portions?
So for someone who has already been tracking, they already know. And that's the other thing, right? Is again, your food doesn't change. So you already know what a satisfying portion size looks like for you. For someone who is working on their nutrition and doesn't want to track, then we might use some more guidance around portion sizes. And I quite like the plate by plate approach. So it is essentially a plate planning where we're aiming to have roughly like half of our plate to be carbohydrates. This would be for a fairly active individual. A quarter of the plate could be a protein source, a quarter of the plate could be fruits and veggies, and then you have like a thumb sized portion of fat. So that might look like a tablespoon of oil, it might look like some nuts, whatever that will be. So that could be a way of using portion guidance for someone who is currently working on changing their nutrition. But as we say, for the individual who's been tracking for some time, their meals probably aren't going to change. So they already know how big their portion sizes should be. And I think we get hung up on knowing the exact right portion size as opposed to listening to our body's feedback, because our body will tell us when we're full. Our body, and this may be a cue that we're not used to listening to, or a cue that we actually bypass when we're macro tracking, because we don't eat to hunger and fullness, we eat to our numbers. And this can sometimes look like saving macros till the end of the day and then eating a large portion at night. And that's not actually what most of our bodies benefit from in terms of energy distribution. We tend to function a little bit better when we have a more even distribution of energy throughout the day. So, moving away from macros and thinking about how big our portion sizes should be, is the answer is probably very similar to what you've already been doing, but listening to your body's feedback. And if you do eat too much on one day and go past fullness, your body will naturally respond to that. And you'll probably find that you're slightly less hungry the following day. And it's not necessarily an intentional, oh, I ate too much, now I must restrict tomorrow. It's just, oh, I wasn't that hungry today. Or, oh, I had a really hungry day. And this is where we can see some downsides of macro tracking is what happens if you're experiencing a little bit more hunger than normal on a day. What if you're macro tracking? It's like, oh, well, I just have to stick to what my calories say, even though I'm feeling a little bit hungry. Or what if you get hungry slightly earlier than normal, but you don't normally have breakfast at that time? So, knowing your portion sizes also involves trusting your body to tell you what it needs and being able to respond to that. And of course, there are differences between individuals on how reliable those cues can be. But in general, that trust in your body knows what it's doing. It wants to stay alive, it wants to stay healthy, it's going to tell you. And all you have to do is listen and allow it. That I think is the biggest struggle, as opposed to knowing how big our portions should be.
Very thought-provoking response again. So next question, how do you account for less nutrient-dense foods? So ice cream, chips, what people typically term as junk food, and meals out, which are typically higher in calories than what you would make at home.
So, the first thing to think about is that whenever you eat a less nutrient dense food, that doesn't take away from any of the nutrients that you have consumed. So, eating ice cream, chips on top of a very balanced diet isn't going to impact your health in the sense of taking away from those nutrient qualities. Now, what we're thinking about is okay, so how much of those foods is a good amount, let's say. And I think this comes down to really thinking about what kind of life do you want to live? Do you want to live a life where you can only have a couple of bites of ice cream? Or would you like to live a life where you can enjoy sharing a dessert with someone else from time to time? Or if you're traveling and there's like this unique culinary like delight that is native to that country that you really want to try, are you going to go ahead and try it without worrying about how many calories and how you're going to fit it in? So for most people, if they're eating a balanced diet most of the time and they have the odd meal out, you can maintain a healthy, and this is an active individual, right? Because we're exercising for all of the benefits in terms of our health, our headspace, how it makes us feel. So a healthy person living an active lifestyle can go out from time to time and eat what they want. They can overconsume and still maintain a healthy body composition because we're not doing it every single day for every single meal of the day. So I think that that is a helpful perspective to think about. And we only know by doing it. So the goal should be not trying to account for the less nutrient dense foods because we have permission to eat these foods. We don't need to compensate and restrict just because we had a bit of ice cream. But what we're thinking about is how much ice cream feels satisfying to me. And some people, if they're stuck in the sort of diet mindset and the dietary restriction, it's totally normal to, at this point, feel like, well, I would just eat the whole pint, blah, blah, blah. But again, what we actually find is that doesn't feel nice for most people at that point. So when we remove the restriction and it's just about, let me see how much I actually want, knowing that you can come back to it at any time, we find that a smaller portion can be quite satisfying because we're paying attention to that experience. So that would be my answer. We're not trying to account for less nutrients dense foods. They become an enjoyable part of our diet. And when we're staying active, when we're eating mostly balanced food choices, we tend to discover the amount that feels good to us.
And as you said earlier, if you are in tune with your hunger and fullness levels, whenever you overconsume, your body is going to respond, and you probably find yourself less hungry at a different meal or on a different day, maybe even without realizing it.
Exactly. And if we're most of our, because when we're talking about less nutrient dense foods, usually it's snack foods or dessert foods. Like we can also include meals, like you might want a pizza one day and all the rest of it. But for the most part, we're talking about snacks and desserts, which means that we're typically not hungry when we're eating these foods. Like if I'm going for an ice cream, it's because I want an ice cream. It's not because I'm starving, you know? And that means that, again, when we're not driven by hunger, we're able to enjoy these meals, these foods in a satisfying way. And when it comes to even a meal out, well, you've probably had a balanced breakfast, you've probably had a balanced lunch. You know, you're not arriving at the meal totally starving. You're there to enjoy yourself and you can have a portion that feels good to you. And if you do choose, like I will often intentionally overeat when I'm eating out because it's food that I wouldn't cook myself. And like, let's use the example of recently I was in Peru. Peru has some of the world's best restaurants. I'm going to go to that restaurant and choose what I want. And I'm probably going to eat more than I would usually eat in one sitting. And that's fine because my body will regulate itself. And I want that experience. I don't want to live a life where I can't go to the world's best restaurant and overeat if I want to overeat. Right. So that would be just some things to consider.
Excellent. So if you have a client who wants to move away from tracking and they're currently tracking, could you cover what their experience of this transition might look like? Because the transitional phase, in my experience, is always the scariest and the one where you feel like Bambi on ice. So it might be interesting for the listeners to hear about an example of what this phase might actually pan out to be.
Yeah, I think sometimes we can get very focused on what's the right way to do it. Do I stop tracking my vegetables? Do I stop tracking certain days, certain meals? And there's no right or wrong way in terms of how do we stop. What's more important is the mindset work around stopping, because you could just go cold turkey, right? You could just say, okay, I'm not going to track anymore. But the problem that people experience is the fear of, well, what if I lose control? And, what if I start gaining weight? Those tend to be the common fears. So, what I would work on with a client is introducing more like variety and flexibility, building their confidence in themselves that they're able to enjoy higher calorie foods, less nutrient dense foods, um, and stay connected to that eating experience. And then working on their body image alongside that, because if someone is scared of gaining fat, that's a good sign that they would benefit from working on their body image. And once the mindset piece is in place, there's less stress about moving away. And it's like, well, if I'm going to move away, I can just stop. And that tends to be the most common approach that I help people with, is that they just come to a point where they're like, you know what, I think I'm ready to stop, and then they stop tracking. I think, depending on the level of anxiety, the thought of just simply stopping can be a lot for people, which is where like gradual exposure, as in slowly removing some of those constraints, can be helpful. So it really does depend on how anxious someone is. But for many people, when they've done the work on their mindset, their body image around that, the fear is reduced and they're able to just say, yeah, I guess I don't really need to do this anymore.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, to end the podcast, I actually wanted to bring the conversation back to when I said that I didn't necessarily agree with your statement that outside
Mm.
of a bodybuilding competition, for example, or another physique related sporting endeavor, one couldn't track calories and macros and pursue physique goals in a healthy way. I was actually thinking about that and wondering why I felt resistance to that statement. And it was because I don't bodybuild competitively. And so I thought, well, I don't feel like I have a problem with calorie tracking and pursuing my own physique goals. I actually love it. It's like I thought my second biggest passion alongside creative writing. So taking that away from me felt a really it would feel unhealthy to me because I feel like it brings so much. But at the same time, I realized, well, what I'm taking an issue with isn't really what you said. It's more like semantics. So I thought, well, I'm not competitive, so I'm not pursuing a sport related endeavor. However, I do consider myself a physique athlete for
Yeah.
all intents and purposes, in that I only engage in physique changing behaviors as part of a sport slash art. I see bodybuilding as an art as well as a sport. It feels me, but then once I'm done, I don't need to look muscular to feel good about myself or to have respect for myself or to feel like I have or I can make meaningful connections with other people. So I think I actually agree with you. And what I was taking an issue with was the fact that I don't compete. So I couldn't say it's a sporting endeavor. But in the end, it is because my mindset is that of an athlete. Does that make sense?
100%. And I think that's a great point, because I don't think competition is what determines an athlete. I consider myself to be a runner, and I haven't participated in a race or any competition. And yet I would call myself a runner. And as I said, if I was training for a specific goal, might consider tracking my macros to ensure that I'm eating enough to fuel my performance, regardless of whether I race or not. Like, I might just decide one day I want to run a marathon and I'm just going to run that myself, like that could just be, I could be setting myself a distance goal that I want to work towards. The competition part isn't the thing that determines whether or not I'm an athlete. I think if you're exercising, you're training for a sport, you are already an athlete, regardless of whether you compete, regardless of how good you are, regardless of how successful you are. that's not the determining factor. It's the performance, like the actions that you're engaging in. So the fact that you train, in a bodybuilding way, the fact that you do a lot of hypertrophy, the fact that you're truly interested in probably like the history of the sport, and maybe you follow along. And I don't know if you watch like bodybuilding shows or follow like bodybuilding athletes. I would say that you are a bodybuilder. You are an athlete, regardless of whether you step on stage.
And I think the lesson here comes back to one of the first points that you made about screening not only clients, but if you're not a coach, screen yourself. What are your motivations? As you said, Shannon, calorie and macro tracking isn't necessarily evil in and of itself. I always like to say evil that way.
Mhm.
Anyway, it's the intention behind it that might be problematic. And as long as, even if you don't compete, if you know that your intention is more performance related, or the kind of intention that I described when describing my own passion for bodybuilding, and it's not about having the illusion of control over your own body composition for all the reasons that Shannon clearly explained, then there isn't really an issue with calorie and macro tracking.
Yes, and I will add one thing to clarify as well, because I do think it's important to note, is that we've spoken about how macro tracking can be beneficial for performance. I think it's also important to know that rates of disordered eating and eating disorders tend to be higher in athletes than the general population. So even if someone has performance based goals, it may not be the case that that's the healthiest thing for them to focus on if they are experiencing some of the downsides of struggling with their relationship with food. So I think that that is, yeah, just helpful to know in terms of figuring out what's best for you. If you are placing, because this is the other, like, it goes from placing my worth on how I look and how lean I am to placing my worth on how well I perform. So anytime your worth is outsourced, that's probably when you're going to run into some problems there. So yes, performance based goals can be like absolutely a really empowering thing to work towards, as long as you know that your worth also doesn't rest on how well you do at your sport.
Thank you, Shannon. That's a great clarification and a great way to tie a bow on the episode, really. So before we sign off, how can connect with you, and what would you like to send? Where would you like to send them so that I can add all the links in the show notes?
Yeah, so I will give you the link to my website. That's coachshannonbeer.com. And you can also find me on Instagram at Coach Shannon Beer.
Perfect. So Instagram and your website. That will be in the show notes as usual, dear listeners. And thank you for tuning into this conversation today. Shannon, thank you for making it into a really thought-provoking one, which I told you off air I was really excited about, and you delivered. And I will talk to you all next time.
Lastly, if you want to support the podcast and help me reach more people, please leave a 5-star rating or review on any podcast platform that you're using. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll speak to you soon.